Welcome to Christ the Lord Clearwater's weekly message. I'm Pastor John Backus here in our studio in Clearwater, Florida, where we share the good news of Jesus on the Gulf Coast. We're continuing and concluding today our message series called Hard Truth. Each of the messages in the series flip us upside down, make us a little bit dizzy, maybe even offend us at first, but we follow Jesus into some of his more mature and deeper teachings, always with the surprise twist. Today, we're digging into the wise use of our time. A hard truth comes from an understanding that usefulness is impacted by our time frame. And that means if we don't get our time horizon right, then we're going to break some of the things in our lives and down the road. How this plays out is described in this phrase, what seems to help now fails later, and what seems to fail now helps later. We're going to see some important applications of this switch around. Let's start by talking about time preference, because when we get into the scriptures today from Hebrews chapter 13, we're going to be seeing how our behaviors are impacted by the time horizon we're working with. So to start off, time preference has to do with how much you prefer to do an action in any specific now or then. If you have a very high time preference, it means you greatly prefer doing something at this specific time. It's kind of like a now self. If you have a low time preference, it means you're not pressured or desperate to do something now, that you have flexibility and you've got time to work with, and therefore you have a low time preference, and that's kind of like the later. I can think about later as a person. Now, balancing the usefulness of the now self and the later self is tricky, because what might seem bad can at other times be good. For example, procrastination. If you push something off for a long time and never get to it, it means you and I act irresponsibly, and the further off we push it, the harder it is to actually get it done because we feel bad about it. So pushing something off till later is bad, procrastinating. But saving something for later isn't. If you'd say, I'm not going to spend money on this cheap little thrill, instead I'm going to save it for later, for a rainy day, have an emergency fund, or invest it later. Pushing spending off for later is a wise thing. Sacrifice is taking a hit now that will benefit you or somebody else later. But other times, you're not thinking about later. You're thinking about burning through something real quick, because it's use it or lose it. You got to eat the food now or it will spoil. You can't just let it sit there for a while, because eventually it'll become no good. Now, this time preference and how we view the rightness or wrongness of using things and having actions in a specific sequence is a part of our daily life, whether it's from birth and mom is trying to get the baby food into the baby's mouth, but first the mouth has to open, so she said, open up. And if baby doesn't open up, the food can't go in. As we grow and become maybe a business professional, you've got your planning you have to do, project management, and a Gantt chart or a timeline of what needs to happen when and what order. So today we're going to talk about the same concept, the necessary understanding of the available time we have and how it helps us order our lives. So if we think about a before on the left side and an after on the right side of this diagram, what is, in God's view, the place of being hospitable? This is a topic that comes up in Hebrews chapter 13. Normally, it's easiest to be hospitable when there is someone that we're familiar with, we know their story, and we know they're kind of a good investment of our charity. First we make their acquaintance, and after we've made their acquaintance, then we know if we want to be hospitable to them or not. So normally we would put it over there. However, in the book of Hebrews, the author advises, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. To strangers, people with whom you don't have a relationship, you haven't been acquainted yet. But the Bible author says, move your hospitality to a place before you even know if there's relationship or not. And that's often a bad investment. It would seem like a bad investment. You say, why would I give something if I'm not certain if there will be a healthy benefit or a payback or a mutual blessing by me investing in this relationship? Another example of time preference and knowing the sequence of things in time, it has to do with sex and marriage. Of course, I'm talking about sex in marriage and sexual intimacy. And it seems common and it might make some sense to say, before I ever make a commitment to a person, I'm just going to try them out, test us out. So we'll sleep around a little bit, see who I'm compatible with, if I'm compatible with you, and after we connect our bodies, maybe we'll connect our future. So sexual intimacy might seem wise to put before a marriage commitment. But the writer to the Hebrews says the opposite. He says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. Now, this is a nice way of talking in public about something very private and personal. So he describes the marriage bed and keeping it pure or clean. He's not talking about don't let your potato chips or cookie crumbs fall in your marriage bed, but he's saying keep the pure purpose of the boundaries of marriage where they belong. And let the marriage relationship or the marriage bed be the venue and the setting for physical intimacy. So sex comes after marriage commitment, the writer would say. As we get through this New Testament section of Hebrews, we see there are other issues related to timing that also become moral. For example, empathy for the imprisoned. Do you feel bad for somebody when they're good and then lose empathy for them when the consequences of bad actions catch up to them and think, that's what you get what you got? Or do you say, like, I'm not going to have empathy for you until you fix your life and get it all put together? Sympathy for those who are suffering, it's difficult to be around people who suffer. Sometimes it's harder to watch a person suffer, it seems, than the person who themselves is suffering. And money is brought up too. Now here are the Bible quotes that introduce these concepts and kind of switch around the hard truth of where they belong in a sequence of time and priority. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison. All right, so they're still in the middle of their incarceration. Something got them there, so they might have a bad history, or they're still dealing with the consequences, and until they get out and get cleaned up or straightened or free, there's not much value in thinking about them. But here the Bible author says otherwise. He says, empathize with them even if they're in a place that's not ideal and often comes from not ideal behaviors. Compassion and sympathy for the suffering. Remember those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Even if you're not in the same situation as a person, try to think as if you were, to put yourself with them. And keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have here now. And the question is, why would we care about the sequence of marriage to sex, or sex first then marriage? Why would we care about when we are charitable to people, whether we've got to know them or they're still unknown to us? Why would we care if we're nice to people once they've served their sentence for wrongdoing, or if they're still in prison? The answer to this is found in the verses connected to each of these encouragements. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Be hospitable even to strangers, for by doing so some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Now here's a big reason that opens up the conversation. It says, be hospitable to a stranger because you may not know who they truly are. This is a reference to an event in world history described in the Old Testament where someone was hospitable to strangers coming by, and it turned out they were part of divine being. I mean, they were part of a divine story, a bigger reality somewhere that the hospitable person became connected to by their act of kindness to a stranger. Marriage says the same thing, not by saying there's a bigger world out there, more than just you see, but there's consequence and more accountability than you might think there is. God will judge the adulterer and all of the sexually immoral. Well, if that's the case, then I don't judge what I'm going to do just by what my body wants to do, by where it takes me with my attraction or sex drive, but I will think, why does that sex drive exist, and what's it for, and who designed this kind of thing, and for what purpose am I to use my body and my sexuality? And I think down the road to the day of accountability, where what we do with ourselves will be shown to matter. Our actions will matter on the day of accountability. So our time frame is stretched, and we think in wider viewpoint. Money, why be careful now with what we have, and we're to be content? Well, it's because God has said, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. That this is the voice of the person who created all things, and all the resources that are present in this universe as we know it are under his command. And that powerful person says, I'll be a father to you. Trust me. I will never run out. I will never leave you. You'll never run out of me. I'll never be too short on time. I don't need to be a scarce asset to you, because I will never forsake you. So money, sexuality, hospitality, compassion, empathy, all of these behaviors change if we suddenly have an expanded timeline. There's more to the story. So let's look back to this project management chart. If you know you have a deadline, a hard deadline at the right end of this screen, by the time you hit the end, you better have your project done. But what if suddenly you realized that you could scroll a little bit further, and now you had another 18 months that you didn't think you had? Well, now your organizational approach is going to change. You might do different jobs or time things differently. The time horizon that you're working with impacts the way you act inside of it. So lest we forget, we human beings, with all of our busyness, do have a time horizon, and from our perspective, we see it is from life to death, from birth to death, and then we're done. So that is a pretty narrow, 70-year window for a lot of people. But what if there was more to this project of life than right in front of us? What if there was a way to have an extended life? This is exactly what broke into the world when Jesus' resurrection took place. The eyewitnesses who had seen him die, executed, put in the tomb, later saw him alive. And that's why Christianity changed the world and spread through the world, because the barrier of death as being the last word for a human experience was now broken through, and Jesus showed it was possible to come out on the other side. And what was on the other side? Well, it wasn't just an extended lifespan, but Jesus said, believe in me and you will have everlasting life. A life that just is ongoing and ongoing down the road. So the time horizon we're working with isn't just life on earth temporally, it's life beyond earth, the afterlife, eternally. That's why the Apostle Paul knew that this is a real sticking point, a litmus test for Christianity. He said in 1 Corinthians 15, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. If we're acting as if there's some bigger story and there's not, we're thinking, I have a good reason to act with the day of accountability in mind, or what I do now matters for eternity. If that's not the case, then any future-focused living is just foolishness and waste. Like, use your life now, and when you're dead, there's nothing else. But Paul would go on to say in 1 Corinthians, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who believe in him. So because Jesus rose from the dead and promised that he would accomplish that act for himself and those who trusted him, Christians have said we have to think in a wider time horizon. That's what Jesus taught in the Luke 16 story he told of the rich man and poor Lazarus. What seemed to be helpful in life, the man's wealth, he had good food, fancy clothing, fashion, his own property. But after he died, that didn't help him anymore. And Lazarus, we would describe him as a Christian who had the same messianic hope of even Abraham from long ago. When Lazarus died, he was taken into the company of Abraham, a hero of faith in heaven. And this is a huge switch because Lazarus' faith in the Savior God didn't seem to help him with his financial problems. He was still sitting there begging. It didn't solve the sores on his body that probably smelled bad and looked gross and nobody wanted to come near him except the neighborhood dogs to lick at, sniff at his wounds. No. But what seemed to fail in life, his hope in God, helped him in death and afterwards. This is why Hebrews 13 comes to this conclusion. So we say with confidence, "The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" With this time horizon, how do we make sure we are thinking and living according to the big story? Well, that's what Paul spent much of his writing in the New Testament era focused on. After he met Christ and his view changed, he changed, his future changed, his behavior changed. He said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." Here Paul identifies the gospel, the good news of knowing Christ, his power, his compassion, his justice, and his role in our future. Trusting him, that good news gospel, that's the key to salvation. So what this means then is that anywhere the gospel, the news of what Christ did as our Savior, communicated through the Bible, conveyed and remembered in the sacrament, and applied to us in baptism, wherever the gospel is, there people are touching eternity. And I know it might be hard to see because here on earth, usually the gospel is found in ordinary people in ordinary places, little churches like mine scattered around the nation, imperfect people, yet coming together nonetheless to find mercy in God and to try a new beginning on a new day, even if we ruined the last one. It's this good news of Jesus that keeps our hearts in the right place and our minds in the right place. So what is the value of that which the gospel conveys? What's the value of resurrection technology? What could that go for? What would it do to humanity if we discovered this through medical science? The value of that would just be inexpressible, right? As a product to sell, as a service to sell. Yet some might even say that's not enough. Who'd want to live forever? Eventually you get bored. You get tired of eating the same things. You'd run out of places to explore, as if we know what an afterlife would be like. I wouldn't want to live forever. I'd get bored. There'd be no challenge. I'd play all the games, sing all the songs, meet all the people, and then what? But what if the God who designed us to live and can raise us from death to live again, what if that God knew what human life really could become? What would it look like to have a life? What would life have to be like for you to want it to continue forever? For every day to be a good day, even it didn't have to be the same as the last day, but to wake up with a joy in being alive, a sense of freedom and opportunity, of safety and security and adventure. What would it mean if this were true? And my answer is here in this little video, in this little studio, in this little church in Clearwater, Florida, or maybe wherever you are, where Christian churches are all around the world. The profound truth is, if you're connected to Christ, you're going to know the answer to this someday. So live like it. Live with a higher way of living, a longer view. Don't live just for you for now, but realize that there's more to this life than just me and here. Be hospitable. Practice appropriate chastity and enjoy sexuality in the context God knows is ultimately the best. Be kind and compassionate. Have empathy and sympathy and honesty. Bring these virtues into the world, even just in a little bit, because you know that the best version of these will be part of your future someday. It's hard to see now, but it'll pay off.